A new way to look at death, dying, and end-of-life care.
It used to be in the 30s, 40s, 50s, most people died at home. We then went through a process of medicalization of death. As science came, we had more ability to deal with the unpleasant symptoms and pain that often accompany death. Family members were no longer, they were sort of moved out of the road as medical equipment took over near the end of life.
On the feature interview today, Ray Pennings from Cardus on a new policy paper dealing with end-of-life issues. In the news, Ontario is holding firm on its new sex ed curriculum in the face of mounting parent opposition, including a possible parent strike that's planned for this week. There's a new analysis that says the Supreme Court's Loyola ruling could have a big impact on the legality of Alberta's Bill 10, and ARPA gets backing from a very unlikely source in its court challenge asking for access to abortion records in Ontario.
And now, Lighthouse News. Lighthouse News is a presentation of ARPA, the Association for Reform Political Action. Here's your host, Al Sebring.
The controversy over the new sex education curriculum in Ontario just won't go away. Last week, a group of parents, about a half a dozen of them representing a variety of faith groups and other parent organizations, met with Premier Kathleen Wynne, asking her to revisit the introduction of that new curriculum, which is set to take effect in September. Gwen Landolt from Real Women of Canada was part of that meeting. She says the Premier was not terribly receptive to the message the parents were bringing.
She was surprised that we adamantly stated we wanted the curriculum withdrawn. She says it's not going to be withdrawn. So she says then we'd like you to have a pause to reconsider it so that the parents can be consulted or that a survey be done of the parents. Again, they said no. I don't think that she's going to budge an inch. We told her we reached an impasse, that the protests will continue, and it's her problem, not ours.
It remains to be seen how this will actually work itself out, but some parents say they're going to take their kids out of the public school system for the entire week this week to send a message to the government. Other parents say if the government doesn't back down, they will take their kids out of the public system in September and put them into alternative or private schools. It's been a while now since the Supreme Court of Canada issued its ruling in the Loyola case. That ruling, as you'll recall, established the principle that education is not a neutral enterprise and that parents have a right to have the morality and worldview they hold to at home carried over into the school setting, particularly in private and Christian schools. The ruling was specific to Quebec's efforts to have religion and ethics taught from a so-called neutral perspective, and it upheld the right of a Catholic high school to teach those things explicitly from a Catholic worldview. Now, John Carpe from the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms in Calgary has done some analysis of that ruling, and he's come to the opinion that the ruling spells big trouble for Alberta's Bill 10. That's the new law that says all schools in Alberta will have to set up gay-straight alliances if even one student requests the establishment of such a club. Carpe told a meeting in Medicine Hat last week that the problem with Bill 10 fundamentally is that it doesn't allow any schools to opt out of the establishment of those GSAs.
It certainly appears that Bill 10 is in conflict with what the Supreme Court of Canada has said in Loyola. And if there were to be a court action in the future, the court would follow the Loyola precedent and would likely notice that Bill 10 has no exceptions, no exemptions, and that every school in Alberta is legally required to host a club or an activity that has a doctrine or belief system or worldview that runs at odds or may run at odds with the school. Okay, there are lots of schools in Alberta where a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance, would be completely compatible with the school's culture. But Bill 10 doesn't respect those differences that could be appropriate for some schools, not for others. It's every school in Alberta that is required to have this.
Carpe says in light of the Loyola ruling, he's hoping the government will amend Bill 10 to allow for exceptions rather than forcing this case into court. Speaking of John Carpe, he scored another win last week, this time in the form of a letter of apology sent to a pro-life activist who was roughed up on the campus of Calgary's Mount Royal University for distributing pro-life literature there in February of 2013. The activist, Nicholas MacLeod, got a letter last week from the president of the university, Dr. David Doherty. In that letter, Doherty apologizes twice for what happened. He also wrote that campus security officers will be given supplementary training to ensure they understand the interaction between the Charter of Rights and their duties to maintain a safe campus environment. There's no word on whether Mr. MacLeod received any financial compensation in the case. Last week, we told you about ARPA's pending court challenge of Ontario's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, specifically a challenge to Section 5.7 of that act, which says statistics on abortions are explicitly excluded from Freedom of Information requests. Now, there's support for this position from what you may consider to be an unlikely source. The Ontario Civil Liberties Association has weighed in on the case, saying that withholding those stats is, quote, contrary to the principle of transparency and accountability in a free and democratic society. We Need a Law director Mike Schutten says support from a group like the Civil Liberties Association may seem surprising and a bit counterintuitive, but actually, he's not surprised at this.
Historically, we've seen that civil liberties associations right across the country, they have always been very vigorous defenders of free speech. I looked up a quote from John Dixon from here in BC, representing the BC Civil Liberties Association. And just a couple of years ago, he was asked about what some pro-lifers were doing in regards to distributing pamphlets in a neighborhood. And he said, while we support a woman's right to choose, he said, and I quote, "I'm discouraged to see old comrades in the fight for democratic freedoms acting as though they are so afraid of argument and advocacy for the other side that we should embrace the illusory comforts of censorship." So, traditionally, civil liberties, like I said, have been very robust defenders of free speech, and we welcome them in this court challenge against the government of Ontario.
The association posted a position paper on its website last week. We linked to it from the Lighthouse News homepage. Another quote from that position paper: "There is palpable institutional bias against pro-life advocates in Ontario, which is harmful to society and substantively unjust toward members of that community." Back with more after this.
ARPA Canada has a new office. We want to especially thank our donors for making it possible to have a central office in our nation's capital and allowing us to continue to be a salt and light in Parliament. If you're in the area, we invite you to stop by. The address is 130 Albert Street, Suite 2010. Again, that's 130 Albert Street, Suite 2010 in Ottawa. Feel free to email us at info@arpacanada.ca.
And we're back on the program. The issues of euthanasia and palliative and end-of-life care have been getting more and more attention in Canadian society lately. Last year, the NDP's Charlie Angus introduced a motion to develop a comprehensive and improved strategy on end-of-life care. A few months ago, the Supreme Court rendered its judgment in the so-called Carter case, effectively striking down a criminal code provision against doctor-assisted suicide. In the middle of all this, the Cardis Foundation came out last week with a new report on this. It's called Death is Natural: Reframing the End-of-Life Conversation in Canada. The report's lead author is Cardis Executive Vice President Ray Pennings, and he joins me on the line from Calgary. Hi, Ray. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Al.
As I mentioned in the introduction, there's been a fair bit of discussion about end-of-life issues lately. In the middle of all this, Cardis comes out with this report. Is the timing coincidental? What prompted you to write this?
No, certainly we were more than cognizant of the Supreme Court's decision in Carter and the fact that there will be a focus on the legislative side over the course of the next year as Parliament sees with making a decision on how it's going to implement the court's instruction. It seemed to us that there was a distinct parallel strategy that was necessary to focus on palliative care, and two things that are central to this report. One, whereas in the legal proceedings, the individual and the individual's choice is being made as the centerpiece of the entire conversation, we wanted to frame a counter-narrative, if you will, which I think reflects the reality that it's not just the patient, but it's also their natural caregivers. As I said, when I was interviewed on CTV on this, the reporter asked, don't I have the rights to do what I want with my own body? And at the end of the day, the death of an individual is not just about that person. I'm not just an individual. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a co-worker, I'm a citizen, I'm a neighbor. And recognizing the fact that we are placed in community, that we live in community and we live in relationship, and that this entire discussion needs to be framed with not just the patient, but also their caregivers is central to the purpose of this report.
One of the interesting things in the report is a survey that you cite, which says that 75% of Canadians say they'd prefer to die at home, but that in actual fact, about 70% of all deaths take place in a hospital or an institutional setting. This hasn't always been the case, right? What's changed?
A couple of things. First of all, it used to be in the 30s, 40s, 50s, most people died at home. We then went through a process of medicalization of death. As science came, we had more ability to deal with the unpleasant symptoms and pain that often accompany death. But what was interesting is not only did the location of death change, but also the engagement of death. Family members were no longer, they were sort of moved out of the road as medical equipment took over near the end of life. We're now faced with a situation as the baby boomers are entering into their final stages of life. In the next 30 years, we in Canada are going to have double the annual deaths, it's estimated, than we have today. We already have a healthcare system that is not able to deliver on the capacity that it promises, as the poll that we engage shows. 73% of Canadians are concerned about that. So I think many people are recognizing that whole process of medicalization of death and using every piece of medicine just because it's available. And that's one of the things we highlight in the report as well. This is not about using every medical means to extend life for a few more days. The irony is that when you take this alternative approach to death, we in fact end up living longer.
I'm going to quote a few lines from the report on that. And the quote here is, "Those on all sides can agree that a humane end-of-life treatment plan would accept the inevitability of death, and that providing support to the patient and their loved ones throughout the natural process of dying need not make use of every life-extending technology and treatment just because they're available." To me, this raises an important issue. Medical technology, as you said, in the last 50 or 60 years has advanced greatly. But what the quote is saying to me is that just because we can extend life, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to. Who gets to make those kinds of decisions?
One of the things that this report calls for is the fact that we spend more time in what's called advanced care planning, thinking about these matters and talking about them, where we can do so outside of the immediacy of the circumstance and be able to reflect more principally on what are the boundaries and what are the guidelines that ought to accompany those decisions. The other aspect that we highlight in the report, we use three lenses, and one of them is what we call a social architecture approach to end-of-life issues. And really the argument is this is not just about the health system and health professionals. There are a range of spiritual needs, emotional needs, dealing with family. And when we put the patient and their caregiver at the center, it just doesn't end with the death of the patient, but also carrying during that bereavement and grieving period for the family needs to be part of the conversation as well. So we're really calling for a much more holistic and comprehensive view and dealing with the situation that engages us as whole people, not just as physical people.
We're just about out of time. A couple more questions. A, how has the report been received? And B, ultimately, what are you hoping to achieve with this document in terms of policy direction?
We released the report at an event in Ottawa. It was co-sponsored by MPs from the Conservative, Liberal, and New Democratic caucuses, and we had a good event in Ottawa. Had national news coverage. In the first day, over 60 newspapers across the country picked it up. So we're certainly very thrilled with the reception the report has garnered in its first few days. But this is about stimulating a broader conversation, and certainly over the course of the months and year to come, we will be looking for opportunity and delivering follow-up research to continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Just a quick note to our listeners, if you're interested in that report from Cardis, we have a link to it from the Lighthouse News homepage.
This has been Lighthouse News, delivering news and commentaries on today's current events to equip Christians for their task in the public square. Production Manager Brian Grimm. Technical Director Nate Bosher. Questions or feedback? You can leave us an audio comment by clicking on the answering machine button at the top of the Lighthouse News homepage, or you can send us an email, info@arpaccanada.ca. Be sure to join us again next week for another edition of Lighthouse News.